So much for the warm introduction and the warm welcome. I'm really delighted to be here with you today. First, because it's my mission to go to every college and university in the state. I've been in my position for about a year, and I would say I've been about a third. So coming to Weatherford College is a pleasure for me today, and thank you for hosting. Also, I am pleased to be here because the North Texas Community College Consortium is an organization that I've had the pleasure of working with in my former capacity at the Dana Center. I've worked with Christine for several years now, and I really believe that this organization is the premier regional organization in the state in terms of bringing different institutions together to focus on common issues, common problems, and coming up with really constructive ways to address student success issues, thinking about a very mobile student population and trying to support them to be as successful as they can be. So you'll see that I'll highlight the North Texas Community College Consortium a bit as we get into a discussion of the regional targets under the 60 by 30 Tex plan. Again, thank you for having me today. So we're going to go in two parts. The first part of my talk is going to focus on 60by30tex.com, or sorry, 60 by 30 Tex. There's a website called .com, and give you a little bit of a progress update on how we're doing on the goals and targets. I'm going to assume that most folks in the room know about 60 by 30 Tex. Yes, we've all heard about it. There's a lot of referencing it. We heard in the legislative session a lot of talks start with some discussion of 60 by 30 Tex. So I'll assume that you have the background on that. And but today we're going to climb into the data a little bit. So I am a self-proclaimed maybe data wonk or data nerd. So I'm going to ask you to come with me today, find your inner data nerd for the next 40 minutes or so as we climb into some information about the statewide data and then a deeper discussion of the regional targets under the 60 by 30 Tex plan. So as you know, there are four big goals under 60 by 30 Tex. The overarching goal is to support 60% of Texas residents ages 25 to 34 to earn some sort of post-secondary credential, certificate, or any kind of degree by the year 2030. There are also three supporting goals. The first related to completion. This is really focused on institutions of higher education and the number of awards that they are conferring. The next is related to marketable skills and wanting to make sure that every graduate is completing a program with identified marketable skills. And then the fourth is around student debt and wanting to make sure that student debt is manageable, balancing, making sure that students are taking out enough to come into higher education, make that human capital investment, but not so much debt that it's burdensome to them. So each of these goals are very important. We often talk about this in light of global competitiveness and economic competitiveness, but higher education is an important part of our social fabric and strong communities and health in a variety of ways. So for all of these reasons, increasing the levels of attainment in the state are important for our future. From an economic perspective, we know that more and more jobs, especially after the 2008 recession, are requiring higher levels of education. And so for students and families to have livable wages, we know that many of these jobs are going to demand higher levels of education, a certificate or above, something beyond high school. So where are we now in terms of this 60% goal? We know 60% is a very ambitious goal to shoot for by 2030. So we have our work cut out for us because as you can see right now, for our baseline year, we were at 40.3, and in the most recent year, we're up to 41.0. So we've made a little bit of progress, but each year we need to be increasing about 1.3 percentage points in order to reach that goal. It does look like we have the preliminary 2016 data. It's looking like we made some good progress, but we know that this is kind of a lagging indicator. So hopefully since the start of the plan in 2015, new efforts will sort of energize and accelerate that rate of progress. But what you'll see here, and for most of the goals, is that in our one-year progress update so far, we know that we're making progress, generally moving in the right direction, but the progress is fairly modest. So in order to achieve the ambitious goals, we'll need to collaborate, find new strategies, and find ways to scale efforts that have been successful to meet some of those targets. Going back to the completion goal, This specifically is about aiming for 550,000 certificates, associates, bachelor's, and master's degrees in the year 2030. So not cumulative, but in that year 2030, all the institutions of higher education in the state, publics, independents, career schools, all contribute to this goal of getting to 550,000. We also have some specific targets for populations who have historically not earned as many awards in the state of Texas and nationally. We have targets for African American students, Hispanic students, male students, economically disadvantaged students, and we also have a target around improving the rate of high school students graduating and coming into higher education the following fall after they graduate. And so I'll go through the data on each of these. Again, this is kind of the same storyline. Some positive, modest progress, but not enough to reach our goal. We're a little bit kind of below the rate that we want to be at. But what you can see here is that in the most recent year, we have 321,000. From the colors, you can see the different levels of credentials here. So light blue is master's, dark blue is bachelor's, yellow is associate degrees, and green is certificates. And what you'll see is that bachelor's degrees make up the largest share of the completions at this time, but associate's degrees are actually the fastest growing. So it's important to note that that's where we see where a lot of the potential for reaching this goal is going to come from the two-year space, certificates and associate's degrees. For Hispanics, similar. We have seen an increase over the last year up to, let me see here, about 103,000, 104,000 on our way to, sorry, it's a little bit small here, 285,000 by 2030. I do want to point out for African Americans, however, this is one of the areas where we have actually not seen progress. The numbers have actually gone in the wrong direction. So in this most recent year, the number of African American completions actually went down a little bit. So this is one area where we're going to need to continue to focus and think about new strategies that can help support these students. From our analysis, we've seen that some of the decrease is actually coming from career schools, and either through closures or other issues, fewer African American students are actually completing at career schools. But what it says is that as career schools are maybe closing, that there's an important market of students who are not being well served or not being supported that need to come into hopefully our public two-year, public four-year independent institutions. The next target is around male students. You can see males and females here. Again, males have kind of that modest increase, but they didn't close the share. So females also increased over the last year, so this is good news, although by 2030 we're actually hoping for parity between males and females. But the gap is quite sizable, 58% to 42% for females and males in terms of the most recent year of completions. And finally, we're also focused on economically disadvantaged students. Positive growth here from 114,000 to 119,000, but ultimately aiming to get to 246,000. So there is quite a bit of work to do here. Something I want to highlight in particular about this target is that the population of economically disadvantaged students is very large. It's actually larger than the population of students who are not economically disadvantaged. So if you were to show the number of completions for the economically disadvantaged students, it actually looks like they have quite a few. But the problem is that population is so large, they have very lower likelihood of graduation. So this is really important that we think about not only getting them to graduation, but really how many more students we need to be bringing into higher education and how we help them complete successfully. And finally, the last target under the completion goal is to focus on high school to higher education direct enrollment, so that following fall after they complete their high school degree. And so this is another area, this is the second area where we've actually seen the needle go in the wrong direction. So this is the second year in a row that the rate actually went down a little bit. So we went from 53% to 52%. Ultimately, we're aiming to get to 65%. So we've dug into this one a little bit more as well. And what we're seeing is actually that the number of students coming directly from high school and higher ed has gone up in two-year publics, it's gone up in four-year publics, it's gone up in private institutions. What's happening here is that the number of high school graduates that are completing is growing much faster than we're bringing them into higher education. So I think most people feel like we're growing enrollments generally, we're bringing more students in, but actually the rate is not as fast as what the state needs to keep up with this very dramatic growth in the number of high school students. And Texas is in a really unique position. Most states are starting to deal with a decline in their high school age population, and it's having dramatic effects for higher education. But Texas is one of the few states that's continuing to see rapid growth. So there's both the challenge and the reward of that in terms of having a robust population with a lot of growth, but a challenge for this particular issue. We also saw that generally this decrease in the high school to higher ed population, it's not unique to any race or ethnic group. It's not unique to a particular gender. It's happening in almost every region of the state. There are just a couple, 2 or 3, that actually saw any improvement on this measure. So what we're seeing is this is kind of a general phenomenon of growth in the high school age population, and also low unemployment. So it's kind of these global factors that are some of the challenges that we're seeing, but it's not unique to a particular student population, which I think is interesting. All right, going into the third big area around marketable skills. Generally, this is one of our I would say this is the least specific of the goals. This is a work in progress. The goal is that every graduate would complete in a program with identified marketable skills. So some of what I've laid out here is just what is a marketable skill. And these are areas that are interpersonal, cognitive, or applied skill areas that are valued by employers and are primary or complementary to the major. So there are going to be guidelines coming out. Actually, at our board meeting next week, there's going to be some discussion of a set of guidelines to help institutions figure out how to approach work on this goal. So to this point, we've really only been tracking one target under this particular goal, which is to look at the proportion of students working or enrolled 1 year after they complete a credential. And the goal is to stay maintained at about 80%. It's been about 80% for the last several years, and we said that's a good benchmark. We want to see that we kind of stay at that level. For a couple of reasons, we don't aim for 100%. One is that we're actually looking at just Texas data in terms of unemployment insurance records when we track this. So we know students go out of state after college, we aren't going to be able to pick them up. We also have records if they're employed by the federal government, but if you're working for your own small business or in other capacities where you wouldn't be caught in the unemployment insurance records, we know that we're not going to be able to catch you. So 80% is what we think is a reasonable effort. And finally, student debt. The big goal here is to maintain a level of debt that's manageable. And the way we think about manageable is to say that your debt be no more than 60% of your first year wage. So instead of saying debt in an absolute sense, we're thinking about debt as manageable because when you take out a lot of debt, but you also come out in a high wage job, that debt may not be unmanageable. But even $2,000 or $5,000 of debt may be very unmanageable for the student who drops out, never gets a credential, and doesn't end up in a high wage field. And we actually see the highest rate of default between $2,000 and $5,000 of debt among non-completers. So we want to think about, so that's how we're thinking about calculating and measuring what kind of debt folks have. So here what you can see is a graph that shows the distribution of all the graduates in a year. So this is for the year 2014. There's a lag because we need to go find them in the workforce after they complete. And we take all the students who graduated and for whom we have wage information. And we look at that debt as a proportion of wage. And then we line all those students up. And we find the median student. And we say, our goal is to stay at 60% for that median student. And that's exactly where we are right now, is at that 60% mark. So that debt is no more than 60% of wage. Okay? So we're doing well in this regard. But what you can see from the distribution graph here is that students are really clustered actually on the low end of debt as a percent of wage. So this is actually, in my mind, pretty good news. That the highest number of students are around 20–25% of debt as a percent of wage, but there are an equal number of students on either side of the median, right? So there are as many students above the 60% mark, but what you see is that there are fewer students kind of way out on the tail over here. But the majority, or the largest number of students are clustered here on the low end. So just understanding about debt, that just tells us about students who have debt. We don't know without this kind of second target what proportion of the student population are those who have debt. So we're also tracking, we want no more than 50% of graduates to have some sort of debt. And we're doing well in this regard also. We're at 48% right now. And you can see how the debt, the proportion of students with debt varies by associates, certificate, and bachelor's. And finally, the last target under the student debt goal is related to excess semester credit hours. This has probably, in the two-year space, been the one that I've heard the most about kind of in the last year or so. This has been a major factor, or at least a rationale that's offered behind a lot of the guided pathways work, is saying we know there are lots and lots of students who are paying 50% more for a degree when they take 90 hours instead of 60 for an associate's degree, for example. But the good news in this update here is that we saw a drop of 5 excess semester credit hours from 30 to 25 in a year. That is a very big drop to see in 1 year. And that's broken out by sector, but it actually dropped the overall statewide, including bachelor's and associates, down by 2 from 20 to 18. So the two-year institutions have really been driving the progress that we're seeing on this particular measure. And so that's a kudos to everyone who I know is working hard on some of those guided pathways, advising, looking at I know this happened a couple of years ago, but bringing degrees down to 60 hours. These are some of the things we think that we're starting to see add up here. So I included this information. This is maybe very basic, but as I've talked to a lot of K-12 audiences, I've heard that there's still kind of a lingering thought that not everyone needs to go to college. And even when you explain, we're not just talking about bachelor's degrees. Yes, everyone doesn't need a bachelor's degree, but what we're seeing is that lots more people need something after high school. And that argument may feel like you're preaching to the choir, but I feel that argument needs to continue to be made in many audiences. I was talking to a superintendent who said, we've got 40% of students going into higher ed, and that's about where it should be. And I said, well, you know, chuckles up here in the front. And so we talked about what a livable wage looks like and the likelihood of being able to not only have your first job, but your 5th job 20 years from now, and the importance of having a credential. So I offer this just to show, I think when you talk to students, they talk about getting a job and they talk about wages, and there are lots of ways that we can help promote to leaders within our own institutions, leaders in K-12, and students and families about the importance of making an investment in higher education. So this just summarizes what I've gone through to this point, which is each of the goals and targets, where we were in the baseline year, 2015, and where we are now. And I want to just highlight those 2 areas, African American completion and high school to higher education direct enrollment, to call those out to say those are the 2 areas where we actually have not seen the progress that we need, and want to ask you, just with the person next to you, just take a minute to discuss African American completion and high school to higher education enrollment, just based on what you've heard today. Just what are your reflections on that? What questions do the data raise for you? And what are your hunches about what you think might be going on or what might help address this? So I'm just going to give you 2 minutes. Talk to your partner. See what you think. Okay, I'm going to cut discussion. I loved how much energy was just in the room in the last couple of minutes. It sounds like folks had a lot to say, and either good questions or ideas about what they think is going on. So this is the teaser here, is that we're actually not going to discuss yet, but there's a breakout right after this. So if you want to talk about any of these discussion questions that I'm popping up here, stay and we can have a good discussion about them in the breakout. So I just want to quickly highlight the other thing that we'll have time for in the breakout if there's not enough discussion, but it sounds like there's a very lively group here, so we'll probably have plenty to talk about. So the other thing that I want to just mention is that there We have 2 new data resources that are in support of the plan, and so one is very explicitly, it's called 60by30tx.com. So www, this is one of those times where you can pull out your phone or your iPad if you want. 60by30tx.com is kind of the place to learn about the plan and track progress towards the plan. You can look by region, you can look by institution, you can look statewide, you can download graphs, pop them in PowerPoints. It's a great resource. And also you can get it on your phone, on your iPad. It was all designed to work that way. So you're in a meeting and you want to go check your institution and how well are we doing on our completion goal, boom, go get it. The other thing I'll mention is that we have revised the accountability system to align to 60by30 text, and you can also get there. So in the breakout, I'll have hopefully a little time to show you where those things are, so you can use those as you need. But we'll go ahead and jump into the regional targets, because I think that's what people are most interested in. So first I'm going to give you my pitch on why I think regional targets are a really good strategy under the plan. The first thing is that we've set these really big goals. And one of the things I hear when I'm out in the field is, okay, great, 550,000, what am I supposed to do about that? What's my piece? How do we break down getting to 60% attainment in the state? And what's Weatherford College supposed to be doing about that? Or what is UT Austin doing about that? And so the idea here is that we thought we need to break these big goals down in a way that's more actionable and more operational for people. At the same time, think about, for the 60by30 goal, that's really looking at all people in the state of Texas, ages 25 to 34. We get that information from, that's not higher ed data in particular. We get it from basically the feds, from the information you provide on the census called the American Community Survey. And what we do is we say, everybody living in Texas, what's your level of education? Maybe you went to Berkeley and now you live here in California. Maybe you live here in Texas now. Pause. All right. How about that? Better? Yeah? Okay. Thanks. And maybe you got recruited for a job, so now you came to Texas. So we're including all of those people who come into the state who live here, may or may not have been educated in the state of Texas. Many, many people were educated here, so that's obviously part of it. But migration is an important factor, and the workforce is an important factor in terms of how do we bring people into the state who are who have at least a credential or certification or above. And so just for that particular goal, we might think about how do we engage workforce and business to help us get to this 60% goal. We also want to think about, from the high school to higher ed target, we're not going to do that by ourselves without partnership with K-12, right? So we need a way to bring people outside of the higher education space to work together. And so, as I said, business and industry, K-12, there are lots of organizations like the North Texas Community College Consortium. There are advocacy organizations like the Dana Center or Educate Texas. Lots of folks that would need to come together to do this big lift. So part of this is about how do we organize people or help mobilize people to come together and focus on and work towards the big goals that we've laid out here. In terms of, I already sort of mentioned this, but particular institutions have said, I want more guidance about how many credentials we should be producing. We've also seen that some regions have begun organizing around 60by30 texts in explicit ways. For instance, El Paso, that area has 60by30 EP. So they're organizing around bringing community partners together, K-12, higher ed together, to focus on these things. There's also been work in Northeast Texas, kind of Texarkana College and surrounding area, really doing a big push around 60by30 texts. They have a great video. If you haven't seen it, 60by30text.com. There's a great video that shows all these students who are kind of the 25 to 34-year-olds of the future, and they're sitting in a space not unlike this, and right now they're at about 29%. So you see all these kids leave till they get to here's the 29%. But anyway, it'll make you cry. Get a tissue. And then finally, we feel like the state will be more likely to achieve our goals if we're being transparent about the action and our commitment to student success. We also think that the regional approach is important because regions and institutions in them differ in really important ways. Demographics are different. The mix of different institutions are different. The labor market is different in different regions. But we also know that there's a lot of kind of regional context embedded. So 80% of students in Texas stay in their region when they go to higher education. So yeah, some people go out of state. Some people maybe leave the Metroplex, go to Central Texas. These things happen, but the vast majority of your students are staying in the region. That's from high school to higher ed. It's also true in transfer patterns among institutions of higher education. And finally, we think that institutional target setting will be improved if you're thinking in your regional context. And this is important in a couple of ways. So if your plan is to increase enrollment, but all it does is take enrollment from your neighboring institution, as a state, we haven't raised all boats, right? Also, there are some institutions that are planning to grow more. There are some that have capped enrollments. They're not going to be growing much anymore. So that needs to be something that is understood within a region about how institutions are growing, what are your goals, and making sure that the goals are kind of relevant for your context, right? So what we're proposing, this is a process that's already underway, is actually going to be formally approved by our board, hopefully on Wednesday next week. But we've picked out 3 areas. So I just went through all of the goals and targets with you at the beginning. We've picked out 3 areas because we thought, let's not overly complicate this. Let's stick with kind of the biggies. So we're focused on the 60 by 30, the overall educated population goal. We're focused on the overall completion goal of the 550,000 certificates, associates, bachelors, and masters, and then the 65% high school to higher ed target. And I'll talk a little bit about why we selected those in particular in a minute. But the second step then is that we have, in the first step, we've taken basically the targets and goals and broken it out with regional data, information on regional population, regional enrollment, different types of institutions, et cetera. And we've broken those down into the 10 higher education regions as defined by the coordinating board. We can also talk about that. Lots of people have different kinds of regions out there, but we're working with the 10 coordinating board regions. So now that we've done that analysis, put together preliminary regional targets, we're going to ask regions to come together to identify, this is by August, and I'll show you a timeline in a minute, to ask regions to come together to identify at least one powerful strategy for each of these 3 areas. How is it that you think you're going to help get to your educated population goal, your completion goal, and your high school to higher ed target? And then specifically for the completion goal, we're going to ask institutions to work together to self-identify their institutional targets for completions. Okay? So 2 of these goals, the educated population goal and the high school to higher ed, they actually are not things that we can measure by institution. We can only measure them at the regional level or the state level. And so let me explain that a little bit. So when we think about the level of education in the Metroplex, we wouldn't say that the number of residents with a credential of some kind is the responsibility, in particular, of Dallas County Community College or of Tarrant County Community College, any more than we would say it's the particular responsibility of UNT, for example. It really is, people could have come from anywhere in the state, and they could have come from anywhere in the country to be here. So this is, when I explain that this is a survey of all the residents, this is talking about the people who live in an area. How educated are they? So that's what we're tracking. And so that's why it doesn't make sense to do it at a particular it's not attributable to a particular institution, okay? So this is a big difference in a question we get all the time. What's the difference between the 60 by 30 goal and the completion goal? This is the big thing. A survey of residents, not particular to an institution, versus completion, which is all about individual institutions and the awards that they confer. Same with the high school to higher ed. This is about all the students and do they come into higher education anywhere. So again, these both lend themselves much better to a regional approach than any one institution in particular, okay? But the completion goal is something that is all about institutions, but this is the one we get the most questions about in terms of contributions. And so that's why we also selected this as the 3rd area that we would include in this regional target process. So now that you've heard, there's kind of this regional level work, and within that there's a piece that is an institutional specific piece. What we're hoping to do here is that it gives people the guidance that they need to, we've heard this said, like, you know, once you see the data, you can't help but act, right? So we want to get to this place where people are feeling mobilized and like they have a sense of what they're aiming to achieve, but in a way that has lots of room for local creativity and lots of room for local ownership. That we're not being overly prescriptive about how this needs to happen, but want to nudge people in a direction of more transparent goal setting. We also think it's important for things like identifying the right mix of degrees. So if we need to increase by 50,000 degrees in a particular region, is that going to be driven by certificates, by associates, by masters? That's the kind of operational discussion we want institutions within a region to figure out, but not something that the coordinating board needs to tell you what to do. You need to think about what's your local labor market, what's your mix of institutions, what's the right fit for you. We also want to reinforce existing regional activity. So I talked about the El Paso group, I talked about the Northeast Texas group, but this North Texas Community College Consortium is exactly the kind of thing that we would love to see more of across the state. So we know we are not so naive to believe that this will not be without challenge. This is certainly something that's kind of a new strategy for us. And we know that ensuring cooperation and broad participation might be tricky. There's not, luckily here you have an organization like the North Texas Community College Consortium that might be a natural convener for regional activity. But I think institutions don't tend to think regionally by default. They think by institution typically. So that's something that we're going to need to support and foster. As is working towards a shared responsibility for students. We know that students are highly mobile, and their success is really our collective commitment to success, not any one institution in particular. So those are some of the things that we know will be challenging. Figuring out who's going to take the lead in each region is something that's going to be locally determined, and we're going to ask people to work together in a way that they perhaps have not in the past. So take a little pause, do another minute or so of discussion. And so with the person next to you, again, take a minute to think about just reactions to this regional approach, first of all. And second of all, what do you think that you've learned from working with NTCCC that has helped promote regional collaboration from your experience? And we have to get moving. There are a couple of other things I wanted to show you really quickly. And we'll have a little bit more time in the breakout, but I do want to make sure that, that folks here see a couple of things. This is the timeline. There is one region that's getting started with the regional target work this fall, but for all the other regions, including the Metroplex and others in this room, will be starting after the first of the year. So right now, just consider this kind of FYI. There's nothing you need to be doing yet, but we'll be kind of launching this formally after the first of the year and aiming for those 3 powerful strategies that I talked about and institutional level completion goals by August of 2018. Okay, so there are going to be a variety of ways we're going to try and support folks to do those things. I wanted to quickly show you the numbers. So just in terms of the educated population goal, the way this rate works, it's all the people with a certificate or degree out of the total population. We're at 41% right now, which I've talked to you about. We're aiming for 60%. And when we break this out in terms of on a regional basis, the range is from 47% to 70%. And I'll show you here. So you can see the Metroplex in purple there. So the idea here, you can see the 2015 actual and then the projections for 2020, 2025, and 2030. This is not to say, if you look in that 2030 projection column, you'll see as an average we end up at 60%, but that some regions are higher, some regions are lower. We're taking into account where did you start, and we're asking everybody to grow a lot. What we are trying to do is say, if you started at 29%, 60% is a bigger lift for you. So we're trying to make sure everyone grows, particularly folks who are lower have to grow a little bit more. But this is the minimum that we would need from each region to get to our 60% goal. That's how we're thinking about this. For completion, these are the completion numbers. Again, you'll see in the 2016 column, that is the most recent actual information in terms of completions for your region. Again, Metroplex in purple, and you'll see the projections for 2020, 25, and 2030. I know there are folks who are not Metroplex in here, so you can see your regions as well. But Metroplex, actually, you will see in 2030 has the largest sheer number in the state. So this is going to be an incredibly important region in terms of hitting that overall 550,000. High school to higher ed, just a little visual here. What we're doing is looking at, on the denominator, high school grads that we can track coming out, and we're looking at those who come into higher ed as the numerator. So we're right now at 52%, we're aiming for 65%, and when we look at the projections going forward, the range across the regions are from 61% to 71% to average out to that 65% that we're aiming for statewide. And again, here are the numbers. You can see that we are currently at the 52%, and the range of different regions for Metroplex will end up at about 64% by 2030 based on these projections. Okay? So we're not going to take a minute to discuss because we have no more minutes to discuss. But this is something we can talk about in the breakout if you want. So what do you notice about these numbers? What surprises you? What questions do you have as you look at those? I also have to do one more thing, which is talk about the regional starter kit. This is something that's also in development right now. So we're basically going to start with some coordinating board webinars to say, to bring institutions of higher education together. We also have some K-12 contacts and workforce contacts to start with. We'll kick off with a webinar, but from there we'll be asking leaders from the region to kind of pick up the torch at that point and help organize people for this effort. But we are providing a starter kit, which will have guidance about what could this process look like, how to convene people, a sample agenda if you want to bring people together, all kinds of things that we think might support your collaborative efforts. Also a data workbook, which is all region-specific data for you, which I'm going to preview just one or two things, and then some sample strategies. So, for instance, I just picked some Metroplex data from the workbook for this. You can see population by different age ranges broken out by race and ethnicity. You will see sort of different graphical representations of where regions are and how they compare to each other. You can get into the actual numbers. So let's say you wanted to know, actually I'm going to go for, let me do something else. Let's quickly scan towards, okay, let's say we were focused on the high school to higher ed, and I said for the Metroplex we'll be aiming for 64%. Okay, 64%, that sounds good. That sounds like more. What does that mean? So it provides information like this. So let's say you've got 42,500 now students who are, of those who graduate coming into higher ed the following fall. You would actually have to get to 48,000, 52,000, 58,005 by 2030. So trying to break some of that information down so you can actually do kind of the operational planning. The last thing I wanted to show is that we've included a list of sample strategies in the starter kit. It is in no way exhaustive or directive, just suggestive, okay? So the idea is to give you something to go on. So I just pulled these two. There's one about guided pathways, and there's one about implementing co-rec and supplemental instruction. And the idea here is strategies that are relevant to 60 by 30 techs, high impact and large scale, okay? So you'll see both of these say things like all or most institutions in the region will, or commit to. Or it might be that you're really focused on, for this second one, gateway level courses, and that might be through co-rec or supplemental instruction. What I want you to notice is something like co-requisite. Folks know that there's a big bill that has been passed that's changing developmental education in big ways. This regional target work does not have to be separate from the stuff you're already doing. This is two birds, one stone. And what we want people to do is, you're already doing great work that contributes to the goals and the plan. We want you to connect those things explicitly. And so this is the last thing I'll show you, which is that one of the suggested strategies here is that maybe you're really focused on transfer, so you really want to commit to using field of study curricula as they're developed, and you'll really think about utilizing, embedding, and transcripting field of study to promote transfer. This is just an example. But for each of these, you'll see that there are exemplars or information, a couple of links to get you started. Hey, I could call that person, or I could find out some information just to get started. But here I've highlighted North Texas Community College Consortium because you guys are doing the best work in this area in the state. And so this is going to go out to the whole state, so I wanted you to know that's here, but I also want you to know you can check that box. This could be one of the strategies you want to focus on, is a commitment to transfer. And edit this however you wish, but that's kind of the concept, is that I think people fear that this is going to be one more thing they have to do. The idea is not to do a lot of new things. Maybe there's some new things you want to try, but it's doing it bigger, more systematically. Most students, not 100 students, 10,000 students. All right, so I will wrap there. There are a couple of more things we can go into more detail, and then we can talk about some of the data resources in the breakout. But I'll